Welcome to the History Bards historical movie reviews. It's movie time starting in 4, 3, 2, 1. With your hosts, Michael Zucker and D. Marley. Today's review, the 1984 movie, Amadeus.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the History Bards podcast. This is your co-host, Michael Zucker, author of the Eisenhower Chronicles, and now introducing my other co-host,
D. Marley. Hey, everyone.
So today we're having kind of a special episode as we inaugurate the film version of this podcast, where Dee and I will be discussing a classic historical fiction film, and what better choice to start with than Amadeus, directed by Milos Forman and released in 1984, winner of the Academy Award for Best Picture. Before we jump into that, I just want to mention that we're recording this podcast on June 6th, which is the anniversary of the D-Day landing in Normandy, which is, of course, one of the largest historical events of the last several centuries.
Yes.
All right, so Dee, do you want to expand kind of how you discovered this film? Did you see it in theaters? Kind of your thoughts at the time when you first saw it?
Yes, I did see it in the theater, and as I know a lot of people may not know this, but I love classical music, and it's one of my go-to musical genres that I go to, like whenever I'm in the car or whatever. So of course, whenever I saw that this is coming out of the movies, I put it on my to-do list as to go and see it. So that's, and now I think I've probably seen it 50 times. It is definitely up there in my favorite movies of all time.
Yeah, so you saw it when it came out, and are you interested in the Oscars? Were you following it closely when it kind of competed against, I think, David Lean's last film, A Passage to India, was one of the other films of that year.
Yeah.
So your thoughts on that when it played out?
Oh yeah, I was definitely watching it that night because I was rooting for Tom Hulce to win. I was thrilled that F. Murray Abraham won, of course, but I definitely was following it, not just because of Amadeus, but because I did love A Passage to India. That was a pretty incredible movie as well. But I was rooting so much for Tom Hulce because I think we've discussed this before, but it's like, as historical fiction authors, I think we all get like in our mind what we think people may have been like. And some people may have different views about how they think Mozart was, but to me, Tom Hulce was Mozart. He was what I imagine Mozart would have been like. So I was definitely sitting right in front of the TV whenever that awards show came on that night.
Yeah, and maybe A Passage to India can be like a future episode of the History Bards podcast. So what was that?
I was just going to say, on a side note, talking about A Passage to India and the uniqueness of that movie is definitely something that needs to be discussed, about the relationship between the British and the Indians at that time. I think that would be a fascinating thing to discuss.
Yeah, I think that would be a great episode. And also just David Lean to me basically reinvented the historical epic, and
yes,
it's almost like the king of that genre as far as film goes. So
yes,
to have a whole episode about that. I was saying, so as for my relationship with this film, I'm pretty sure the first time I ever saw it was like my high school freshman band class, which probably sounds like very random, but I think the teacher was really passionate about this and showed it to us.
Yeah.
And I think most of the class was like, why are we doing this? So like I thought it was interesting, and just thought like kind of Mozart's, kind of charisma was interesting. I think the Requiem really caught my attention.
Oh yes.
Things like that. So it made at least, enough of an impression on me that, well, first of all, I would later become a historical fiction writer, but also that I, you know, remembered it and have returned to it over the years. And now, I mean, I would easily consider this to be within my 10 favorite films.
So, like, what's your favorite? Like, if you can even select a scene out of that movie, because there's so many lines and scenes out of that movie that are just incredible. But if you can just like pick one off the top of your head.
I think my favorite scene, and I was thinking about this yesterday as I was planning this out. I think sort of the climactic segment where he is writing the Requiem and Salieri's kind of like taking dictation for him, and it's like as he's describing like kind of this instrument here doing this and
Yes.
this and you just kind of hear it in the background. It's like they're building this thing together,
Yeah.
but we also like know the subtext of that Salieri's trying to essentially work him to death. As
Yes.
kind of within the premise of this film. I think that scene is probably what I think of when I think of this movie.
Yeah. That
Um,
definitely is.
how about you?
I mean, as strange as it may seem, the very beginning, like wherever he starts having the discussion with the priest
Mm,
about where the priest is asking him, to confess to him. And then the culmination of him, discussing the mediocrity.
yeah,
I that just really resonated with me from the sense of back whenever I first started writing Blood and Ink. Um, I wanted to use that same premise between Marlowe and Shakespeare. And I
mm,
actually started writing it as if Shakespeare was confessing the day that he died. Everybody knows that he was back in Stratford and he was terribly sick. And his son was I mean, not his son, his son-in-law was a physician. And so I kind of had the idea of him confessing all of his life to his son-in-law because for some strange reason in his son-in-law's diaries, that day is missing. So whenever I did like all the research for my own book, that was kind of odd to me. I was like, why is that day missing? Because it seems like out of all that would have been something that he wrote down if he was, attending on him or even if he visited him or whatever. That would have been significant for him to write down, but it's not there. So I kind of wanted to use that same premise. And the reason why I didn't is because Amadeus was such a huge success. And I didn't want people to think that I was, kind of copying that. I needed it to be on its own. But I did like that premise. I thought that was phenomenal the way that they developed that.
yeah. I think with that opening segment where Salieri's first playing a couple of his melodies, and the
Yes.
priest doesn't recognize them, and then he plays like a very basic one of Mozart's, and the priest just
Yes.
like instantly knows what it is. I think that's a great introduction to the premise, but also just like when Salieri's like his big confession, he doesn't immediately say like, I killed him. He said it's more just like Mozart was his hero, is the confession.
Yeah. Yeah. He
And I
said he
thought
was
that
his
was kind of
idol.
an interesting kind of character beat, kind of introduced us to like who this is and that kind of conflict of like, on the one hand, he basically worships him as, the
Yeah.
greatest composer of that era, but also was consumed by jealousy because of that.
Yeah. Yeah. And that the whenever the priest says, we're all equal in the eyes of God, and he says, are we? Because he felt like that. But you really get the sense of, Salieri was arrogant. He did come across that he deserved this because of all that he gave up. And that showed such a lack of humility.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned that because that's one observation I've taken from the film the last couple of times that I saw it was this sense of he felt almost betrayed by God by Mozart's
Yeah.
existence.
Yeah.
And I think, as a lot of reviewers have pointed out, that even the title Amadeus, which is Mozart's middle name, means voice of God.
Uh-huh.
Um, that I think one character who I've kind of come to compare Salieri to is Captain Ahab in Moby
Oh,
Dick,
oh
in
yeah.
that they both have this kind of, I think both stories have been kind of framed as like Salieri and Ahab are almost like waging war upon God, but like through like a certain divine being. So for Salieri, it's Mozart, and for
Yeah.
Ahab, it's the whale, and
Yeah.
that kind of like structures like the defining conflict of each of those stories.
I think that's a great
Um,
comparison.
so I think
Great
that's
comparison.
that's kind of like how I've been seeing it recently. Is it's almost like a classical music equivalent
Yeah.
of Moby Dick, which I think is kind of an interesting way to think about it. Um, so I'm trying to think. So I think the big thing that people are probably going to expect us to talk about with this film is that, of the great historical fiction films, it's probably the one most commonly accused of being just entirely inaccurate. um,
Yeah.
that, it usually, I think most historians think that there was, not only did Salieri not kill Mozart, but there probably wasn't even
Right.
like a rivalry almost at all.
Yeah.
Um, and so, but the counter argument to that I've heard and that I thought about is that this film is using a sort of modernist literary technique that, is pretty well known as the unreliable narrator.
Yes.
Um, the notion that, it's not just sort of showing it as though like, let's say Lawrence of Arabia or something where we're just kind of following him along, but it's Salieri describing what his life was like decades after the fact.
Yes.
And so Salieri is the person who is telling us the story. And given that this is decades later and, probably years of kind of obsessing over this, there's a very high likelihood that he's either just totally misremembering or just kind of has invented a story. Um, that, we can discuss kind of like how it compares to other uses of the unreliable narrator technique. I think one of the most famous ones is The Great Gatsby,
Yes.
um, where uh, Nick is the narrator of that, and it's pretty clear that he's maybe not making up everything, but it's like at least distorting certain aspects of what he's
Oh,
saying.
oh, for sure he
I
was.
think.
And talk about a film to talk about. The Great Gatsby is definitely needs to be on our list.
Which one, the DiCaprio one or the Robert Redford one or
Oh,
both?
well, yeah, actually we can discuss both because to me they are vastly different. Um, vastly different in an artistic way. I think the newer one was, for modern viewers. And but I
Yeah,
loved it. I absolutely loved it. And then I loved the older one for its own various reasons as well. So comparing those two would be a great thing.
yeah, that could be an interesting episode.
Yeah, absolutely.
Um, but I think within film, some of the other examples of unreliable narrator, I think Rashomon by Akira Kurosawa is one of the most famous examples, and also I would say Citizen Kane is another likely
Oh,
example that he's going around kind of interviewing all these people who knew
yeah,
Kane, and they all kind of give like a different version of segments of his life,
yeah,
and then that can be kind of like an early introduction of this storytelling uh, style into
yeah.
film.
Which is a great device to use for
Yeah,
historical fiction, even though it may veer into being alternate, you know, and people may have issues with it, because there are some historical fiction readers and critics who want you to stick really, as much to the facts as possible. But using that device is definitely a way of, and honestly, I kind of use that device myself because
yeah,
with Marlowe and trying to tell the story that he possibly was the author instead of Shakespeare. that was pretty unreliable, because we have no idea. So, I'm all for it. I'm all for people using an unreliable narrator.
Yeah, and I would say I used it to a lesser extent in my novel, The Eisenhower Chronicles. On the one hand, it is portraying General and President Eisenhower through 15 different episodes of his career,
Yeah, yeah,
and it's trying to show it. On the one hand, this is kind of objectively what's happening, but also it is his story, and it is from his perspective overall. Even from the chapters that are told in the third person are still from his perspective
yeah,
overall. And so it's kind of like, the slight distortion of the viewing of things, if that's
yeah.
a phrase, of interpretation of history. This is why the first draft is never, but you always
That's
have
for
to go
sure.
back and polish.
Yeah.
It is easier to do when you're writing than recording a podcast. But but that whether it's the Cold War crises or his rivalry with McCarthy or whatever, that the chapters are still viewed kind of like the way that Eisenhower would have interpreted his approach to them,
Yeah,
as opposed to more of like a third person, or like the way that the press would have viewed what
yeah.
he was doing. Um,
I think that's
so I
one of the
think
reasons. Yeah, I think that's one of the reasons why Amadeus works so well
yeah,
is that um, you get so immersed into Salieri's story, and it almost comes out like, wow, did this really happen? And
yeah,
that's what you want as whether you're a historical fiction writer or a filmmaker. You want a moment of pause for the audience or the readers to step back and say, hey, this is a possibility.
yeah. So I think the only question then becomes, does the movie imply at all that this is an unreliable narrator? Because like one of the big arguments I feel like people have made against this film is that Salieri says that he spent his life celibate as part of his kind of sacrifice to God to make him a great
Yeah,
composer.
yeah,
But in real life, he was married and I think had like several children.
yeah.
And so it's like, is he just lying? Has he kind of like forgotten he had a family? The movie doesn't really, comment on that in any way other than just him declaring that he was celibate. So
Um,
is the film trying to insist that this is an unreliable narrator, or is it just playing, very fast and loose with the facts here?
oh, I think it's playing fast and loose because again, we don't know. Even though I loved how Mozart was portrayed, you know, he may not have been at all like that. I just
Yeah.
loved the idea that he had that laugh. I want him
I
to have
think
had that laugh.
I think like Peter Schaefer, who wrote the play that this film is based on, and who I think helped write the screenplay, basically said that like the idea for it came, I think, from reading about Mozart. That like he read Mozart's letters, like it seemed as though they were written by like an 8-year-old.
Well, okay.
That he was kind of like almost like this man child who was also like this, one of the greatest musicians of all time. And so kind of the frustrations that must have felt like to maybe some of his contemporaries. And then there's the kind of legend, at least, of Mozart and Salieri. And so like that's kind of where the entire premise came from.
Well, in using Emperor Joseph's famous line, there it is. There it is. It's like, okay, then I feel like that he must have been like that. if in his if in his letters he was a man child, he was portrayed perfectly.
That's actually an interesting point that is kind of the Emperor's catchphrase throughout this film as well.
Yeah,
There it is.
there it is.
Is that almost like the film is just insisting like, go with it.
Yeah, there it is. Yep. And which was interesting how he was portrayed as well. I
Yeah, I
got
think
I got quite tickled at that. I was like, oh my goodness, this is yeah, I didn't picture him as that way either.
yeah, I think when I was younger when I saw the film, like the Emperor didn't really come off as so kind of, I don't know how the exact word would be, just sort of like not indifferent, but just kind of like ignorant of things.
Yes, very
But I
much
think
so.
seeing it more as like an adult, it's like, wow, this film is really just kind of like proclaiming monarchy as a system of government
Yes, for
that like
sure.
these great artists like Mozart are having to operate under,
Yeah,
like a
yeah.
buffoon like this.
That's exactly the way it came across. Yeah,
Like
sure.
especially that one segment where it's like the fate of these kind of masterful operas that somebody like Mozart was working on. Like their fate is just determined by like how many times did the emperor yawn
Yeah,
upon viewing it.
yeah. I think another part that I really thought was interesting was like whenever I can't remember what they called it, but it was the different theater setting where it was like I guess the lesser. It wasn't the royalty or the nobility. It was like the common people, where he presented the magic flute, and I thought that was really interesting because I don't know, you got like this idea of how being in a theater with the nobility, how that was, but then to be presented with that other scenario was I don't know, it really showed a depth of what that country was going through at that time. The vast difference between the nobility and the common people, like what Marie Antoinette was going through in France.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, I know that Emperor Joseph mentions her at one point, kind of her frustrations with her own people or something to that extent.
yeah, yeah,
Which is also near right there. But also like not just the magic flute, but the portrayals of Don Giovanni between those two
yes,
the
yes,
theaters.
yes,
Whether it's the noble one where it's this kind of grand masterpiece versus where it's more treated as like a spoof in
yes,
the common people's theater. And Mozart's just loving both of them.
yes, he
Where
does.
I think his wife is more offended by what they do to it.
That was the one character that I never really. I mean, she portrayed it great. She's a good actress. She portrayed it great, but I I, I did not like her. I did not connect with her. And of course, I know that happens whether it's movies or books. There's characters that you don't particularly like or don't connect with.
I mean, I don't know if you've seen like the director's cut, which adds however much material to it. But I think it kind of like it builds like the subplot into it where Salieri goes out of his way to humiliate her,
Yes,
and that
yeah,
kind of sets up her kind of characterization for the second half of the
yeah,
film.
yeah.
I think one question that would be kind of interesting to discuss is Amadeus sort of a tragedy in the literary sense?
Mm, wow. I would say, in a sense, um, a tragedy, but it also a tragedy, I guess, from the standpoint of Salieri, and well, I don't know, maybe because of the short life that Mozart lived and his tragic end. But I don't know. I guess what in like the literary sense of a Hamlet, though, you know, that's a true tragedy. Everybody died.
Yeah, I mean, I think in my view, like, yes, it likely counts, but it's not as, I mean, kind of what you're implying, tragic.
Yeah,
I mean, because I don't like part of to me what like the best tragedies, whether it's Hamlet or something like Lawrence of Arabia,
yeah,
what they contain is more of like a character who's sort of very conflicted between different kind of ideas or layers of their personality.
yeah,
And I mean, Salieri's tragic flaw would probably be his jealousy, that he goes out of
yeah,
his way to destroy, this great composer out of jealousy, and
for sure.
then spends the rest of his life tormented from that. But I don't think he quite contains the levels of nuance that either like Hamlet or Lawrence do.
Yeah,
So I think that might kind of downplay the tragic elements in that respect.
yeah, yeah. That's because uh, you know, it, for all intents and purposes, Mozart's life became even grander after he died. So, and then, so from the standpoint of it being tragic for Salieri, yes, because a lot of people don't know about him. And which is curious because after I saw the film for the first time, and, didn't have Google back then, but I remember going to the library and looking up information about him. And then later on through the years, as we had the internet and was able to look it up more, I remember looking up lots of different things about him because, he is such a shadow of that time period. I had no idea that he was a real person, until I was like, wait a minute, what? So I guess from that
Yeah.
standpoint, it is tragic for him.
Well, it's sort of like opposite tragedies in a sense that because I think one interesting part of the film that kind of gives a more nuanced dimension is the fact that clearly within the time that the film is showing, Salieri's the more successful musician of the two.
Yeah.
That he is the court composer. The emperor, declares one of his operas the greatest one ever.
Right.
He's the much more established artist, whereas Mozart is shown as, struggling financially and having trouble gaining popularity. But then, because Mozart dies at such a young age and Salieri lives much longer, that he gets to kind of see what he feared play out.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that nobody remembers who he is by the time that he is an old man, whereas Mozart's music is now, very highly regarded by all of Europe.
Yes. Yeah.
And I think that's just a part of the nuance that I think some people who, when watching this film, don't fully appreciate that they're treating it as though nobody cared about Salieri, and that's what he was frustrated about. When it's much more personal than that as far as the Europe is concerned at that point, he is the greater of the two.
Yeah.
But he understands that that's not the case.
Right.
I think one other thing that I think some people who have not studied it as much as you and I have sometimes say is that it's treated as though Mozart's work came to him just instantly.
Yeah.
Because there's that one scene where Salieri looks at some of his drafts and they're all kind of just first drafts and perfect.
Yes.
But the film also does say that he's working nonstop on his compositions, and that it's not just an extremely easy endeavor that he's going through.
Oh yeah.
So I think sort of to defend the film, it does contain all of that. It's just I guess those get kind of overshadowed by the main conflict.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really interesting because a lot of the composers like that, has been talked about how they worked and how they were inspired. But as writers, we understand that. We understand that there's a whole process. Sometimes it flows easier than it does at other times. Sometimes you have to edit a lot out and sometimes you don't have to edit anything out. So, which is interesting because, that was said about Shakespeare that, he never blotted anything. But that goes into my whole theory that it wasn't him, that he was just copying. But, with composers, the whole idea of inspiration, I guess as artists, we all understand that to a certain level of, that sometimes it comes easier. I know, I've heard other historical authors say, or even any authors say that about how that you get to know your characters so intimately that they're just talking, and it's just coming out. So that's kind of how I feel about somebody at Mozart's level. It had to have been just so much easier for him to compose because that's all he did. It was from the time he was a child. So, yeah, that's kind of interesting that point, whenever he discovered whenever he was looking at the portfolio. I know the scene you're talking about, and they all fall to the floor.
Well, I think there's also like, different artists kind of function a bit differently. I mean, because like, Mozart is, the legend at least is that he kind of heard it in his head and wrote it down perfectly. Whereas I think, somebody like Beethoven is said to have spent, years on his compositions, that did not just kind of come perfectly or instantly or something like that.
Well, that's true,
Um,
but there is have you ever seen Immortal Beloved, that movie?
I have not, no.
Okay, so because it kind of implies that as well in
Hmm.
that movie about Beethoven. Yeah, so that's kind of curious how inspiration comes like that, whether it's but I tend to believe, like I said, that the years and years and years of instruction that I mean, look at authors like Stephen King. It just seems to flow out of him.
Right.
He's constantly coming out with books. Or Nicholas, I mean, not Nicholas, who is it? Is it Nicholas Sparks? Yeah. Isn't he? Yeah,
Hmm.
he's constantly coming out with books. I'm sure there's other ones too. Like Bernard Cornwell, he it's just like a constant flow of books. And so lots of times you sit back and say, how did that happen? But it's like, I feel like it's just because of the magnitude of not only what they put into it, but spending day after day and like 24/7 thinking about writing and characters, that eventually it just starts flowing easier and easier. And that's one of the reasons why as a author myself, ad- my advice to other starting authors or young authors or whatever is that you have to look at this as a long-term thing. You can't look at it like, oh, I'm going to write a book and everything's going to be, no, if you're going to be a writer, then you're going to be a writer for life. And
Right.
I feel it was the same way with with people like Mozart. He was a composer for his entire life. That was his entire life. So it had to have been easier or I won't say easier. Of course, he had to put work into it and everything, but it flowed from him because that was who he was.
Yeah, I mean, I think, probably there were good days
Yeah.
and rougher days. Um, I mean, it would be interesting to kind of dig into like the way that age plays into it, because I know like, somebody like Bob Dylan has said that when he was younger, kind of like in his classic period in the mid 60s, then it felt like he was writing songs almost like unconsciously or subconsciously.
Yeah.
But then like by the late 60s and onward, that he had to more like actually consciously think through what he was doing. Um, so I don't know. I mean, I guess it probably just goes back and forth over time, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah. I agree with that. I mean, I think, again, we've all experienced that as authors, that sometimes it's easier for it to flow. And that's the reason why, the whole thing about um, writer's block. Sometimes we
Yeah,
have writer's block and sometimes we don't. So I'm sure it was the same for people like Mozart.
yeah, that's. But we like return to Amadeus as we sort of start to wrap up.
Sure.
Do you have any comments about either the set design or the costumes?
Oh, phenomenal. It was all phenomenal. You know, for anybody that hasn't ever seen the movie and have even an inkling of interest in Mozart at that time period, I just, everything about it was just phenomenal. It definitely deserved all the awards that it got. Costume design, sets, everything.
I think one thought that I've had about the costumes, kind of the long that I've watched it, or the number of times that I've watched it, is Mozart's kind of outfits really stand out from like the rest of the sort of upper class of Vienna at that time. That he's much more dressed as like the 18th century equivalent of like a rock star,
Yeah,
with kind
that's
of
for
like
sure.
his colorful hair and outfits and
Yeah.
everything, and he just really is. It's almost like is rebelling against the establishment of that time.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Okay, do we
Yeah, I
have
loved
anything
his
else you
pink
want
wig.
to?
His pink wig was awesome.
Although I will say, like when he's, I think it's like later in the film when he's like starting to like burn out and kind of as we work
Yeah.
toward his demise, that like the way his, I guess, just his regular hair looks when it's just
Yeah.
kind of like long and sweaty and kind of
Yeah.
gross. It's just really like, I don't know, it stands out more than I feel like you might expect it to. Like it's just a very like it works well as kind of like a physical image to capture that point of his life.
Yeah, and I think that was necessary because it started making him human, you
Yeah.
know, and that was a necessary part in the movie to his struggle over always wanting to please his father,
Yeah.
and how it started bringing him, and Salieri used that to the ultimate. That's what he knew about him. That's what he learned about him, is that, and that he used it. And then it showed such the human side of Mozart, which connects, viewers who are watching it. Same way with writing fiction, doing that in a book to show the humanness of a character. That's what connects readers to the characters in a book. So it was well done. It was very well done.
Do we want to give it a rating or do we not want to get into that?
Yeah, sure. We absolutely can. So
Sure. So what?
I mean, I definitely, let's say doing 10 stars or what? Because I will give it 10 stars without a doubt.
Yeah, I would too. 10 out of 10 for this one. This is just one of the all-time great historical fiction films, I think.
Yes, I totally agree.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us to talk about this classic film today. We'll be back next week. Again, I'm Michael Zucker, and my co-host,
G. Marley.
All right. See you next week, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you for joining the History Bards historical movie reviews. Please don't forget to click the subscribe button and follow us at our YouTube channel at www.youtube.com/@thehistoricalfictioncompany.